there was a lot of emotional activity that came up, emotions that had been suppressed, situations that I really hadn't quite known what to do with. And here was this beautiful practice that was bringing me to the truth of those situations and allowing me to clear out some of this emotional residue. So I just stayed with it. I just kept practicing.
Welcome to the Daily Soul Bytes show. I'm your host, Bolaabimbolaauthor, and this is a show where we interview guest authors, coaches, and entrepreneurs to share their insights for the expansion of collective consciousness. And today I have a very special guest all the way from Pennsylvania in the US, Miriam Trahan. Welcome to the show, Miriam.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here speaking with you about consciousness.
Yes, brilliant, brilliant. That's one of my favorite topics. And I'll read a bit about your bio before we start, Miriam. So, Miriam Trahan has been exploring the frontiers of consciousness and working with energy fields for over 30 years. She's experienced at articulating spiritual technologies of breath and meditation and their power to uplift our changing world. She studied for 10 years of breath practice, yoga teaching certificate, and she's a current student of light body practice with Duane Packer. And she's been doing that for over 17 years. And she's also the host of a podcast, Miriam's Meditation Podcast. Wonderful. Thank you for being here, Miriam. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks again for having me.
Practicing this for over 30 years. So you're really experienced at this meditation and breath work. How did you become very passionate about this? Give us a bit of a summary of your journey and how you became really passionate about
Well, I came to study of consciousness early as a student of psychology at university. But then in my 30s, I had my marriage had fallen apart. I was at a very low point in my life. I had two young children to take care of. And yet I was still really searching for some kind of way to calm myself, just not be so anxious, to be able to be in the world as my true self, as the empowered person that I always wanted to grow up to be. And I
it.
had the wonderful good fortune of meeting this breath master who had studied in India, Swami Santianda. And she had brought this breath technology, we can call it, to the US and had many, many students. And I really wasn't quite sure what it was at all. I was just very impressed with this person. She was the first person I ever met who had such a solid sense of her own truth. It was not a belief system or something that she was going to try and convince anyone about. It was something that she lived from the depth of her being. And I thought, well, whatever it is that she's doing, I'd like some of that, please. So I went to her classes, not knowing what to expect. And we did these pretty complex breath practices that for the first time in my life, after we would do this very dynamic breathing that she was teaching, I had a sense of calmness and clarity in my inner being. And at the same time, the course was over many weeks. And so as we moved through the coursework, there was a lot of emotional activity that came up, emotions that had been suppressed, situations that I really hadn't quite known what to do with. And here was this beautiful practice that was bringing me to the truth of those situations and allowing me to clear out some of this emotional residue. So I just stayed with it. I just kept practicing. And after a number of years of practice with her, she stopped teaching for personal reasons of her own. And I moved away and we didn't see each other much anymore. And I I became sort of lonely in my practice. And so I decided I would try to teach it. And I began to read quite a lot about breath practice and how doing these kinds of breath exercises affects the body, affects your consciousness, etc. So I went to a lot more classes and studied with other people and began to teach. And I am still teaching breath practice. And and I've also learned more about consciousness through my practice with light body, which is another, it's more of a consciousness kind of study. So anyway, now, COVID came, and I was still wanting to share what I knew with others. Felt like more and more people were interested in this kind of study. And so I made a podcast about it, and I'm still growing strong with that several years later. So that's where we are now.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I loved your response when you had the breakup of your relationship and how you responded to that by seeking something of a higher perspective. Because really, it's down to not what happens, but how we respond to it. This
Exactly.
is this is what because life has its ups and downs. We all have ups and downs. I've had my breakups, and it's about how we respond and how we seek that ease, how we seek a lot more of that spirit being that we are, a lot more of the higher consciousness that we are. So I love that as an inspirational bit that I just wanted to pick up. So I would love to know a bit more, Miriam, about the consciousness. Um, Consciousness is something, what is your perspective about consciousness? How would you define consciousness?
Wow, that's a big question. My teacher, my light body teacher, defined consciousness as any degree of order, which is a very broad definition and includes everything. Everything
Mm,
is ordered. So everything has some degree of consciousness. It's not all equal consciousness, but there is a kind of order. There is a recognition that everything has a kind of vitality. All
mm,
reality has a sort of vitality, and it's not exactly life, like breathing life, like we think of ourselves and animals and even plants, but a kind of awareness. So for human consciousness, we are thinking about being aware of our world around us, having expanding perceptions, being
mm,
able to see patterns, being able to change our perspective to allow some growth. So if we have a consciousness about something that has happened to us, let's say it happens over and over again, and
mm,
we've all had that kind of experience,
mm.
is
Yes,
saying, why is this happening to me again?
yeah.
Um, Having a kind of enrichment of consciousness that breath practice or meditation brings to you allows you to be flexible in your
Mm,
consciousness. And you can look at it from various directions. You can look at it from underneath, you can look at it from above, you can
mm,
ask others and embrace a wider view of what is going on. But the reason for doing all of that is to find what's really truth for us. And
mm,
I think that in just living our lives, we pick up ideas and belief patterns from the wider culture, from our families, from our
mm,
ancestral heritage that may or may not be really true for us. And
mm,
it might have been true at one time, right?
mm,
Because what, and it's not just what works, but what really lives in our hearts, what
mm,
that deeper understanding or perspective of the
mm,
truth for us is.
mm,
And
mm,
the only real way to find that out is to spend time with yourself,
mm,
to meditate or to do a breath practice or journaling or walking
mm,
or um, contemplating, reading other masters or philosophical perspectives. Um, and even if they don't ring true for you, then you know something more about yourself. You've read
mm,
something, let's say a philosophical perspective, and you say, well, I don't think that works for me in this moment. And so now you have more information than you had before.
mm,
So all of that is wrapped around consciousness. And
mm,
I like to think of these things that we're talking about as a kind of inner technology.
mm,
Just like we have technologies on the outside that we use to do different things with, um, And inner technology is something that brings you a kind of facility of mind, or an emotional clarity, or a sort of inspiration or creative inspiration. And so anything that functions in those ways can think of as a consciousness technology.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. I love the way you talk about it as an intelligent awareness that is present in all things, not just living things, but also things that are not necessarily of breath. You know, it could be a rock, it could be a tree, it could be a plant. Some consciousness could be living or non-living. And I think this is the reflection of universal energy, that intelligent reflection. That is and I think that's exactly, I do agree with you completely. And I'd love to know more about how your meditative practice um, has really enabled your clients and yourself to expand in consciousness, to expand in that awareness, because we know we have the ego self that has a lot of identities and has to get on with all the things we have to do on a day to day. And we cannot get rid of the ego self. It's really about how we come to allow it to be driven by that higher self, but that higher perspective. And that's really what my book is about. I've got a book out, Daily Soul Bytes, and it's really talking about the higher perspectives of self and how we can come to understand the disconnections that we have had from our true spirit being. And we can come to understand these different perspectives, the ego self perspective and the higher self perspectives. And the familiarity allows us to align with the higher self perspective, which really gives us our best outcomes. So, over 31 nuggets, I share different perspectives that really help to activate that awareness of intelligent consciousness, awareness of the perspectives that are within us, so we can come to align to them again and again. It becomes easier because alignment is what it's all about. What do we align to? And it's a choice, but it can become a much more conscious choice. So, how does your meditative practice really help to increase that awareness of the perspectives within us? And first of all, what is meditation? What's your perspective on what meditation is? And how do you use it in your work?
Well, I think the popular definition of meditation is sitting around and doing nothing, and that sounds very boring. And that's not the that's not the flavor of meditation that I prefer myself. Um,
It
to
has
me,
its good points. That has its
it
there are
does.
there are sides to silent meditation, but
Yes,
the meditation has a wider definition. Yes.
well, for me, meditation is in a practical, physical sense. It is a state of our brain's energy. We change the pattern of brainwave energy when we meditate. And so we have our ordinary mind that you've been speaking about, our ego consciousness that has to get on with life. And very, very important. We need our ego selves to interact with each other and to interact with the world. So it's not about the ego is bad and something else is better. It's not that at all. It is a deepening of what it means to be human. And so we can reach some of these states of consciousness perhaps when we're sleeping, because we're very at peace and resting. We're quiet. Our ordinary self is not bustling about doing this and that. But when we sit to meditate, and I like a somewhat more guided practice, where I am listening to someone who is sharing, and not just a pleasant walk in the woods or by the beach, which is really lovely and can be very, very useful. And I've certainly used that in my practice, but more to the point of recognizing that what we are exploring is a deeper intelligence to which we have access when we stop being very busy. Eckhart Tolle had a question he posed to his students once, and it was, who are you when you are not thinking? And so it provides a kind of step back so that you can quiet all of that busyness and chatter and noise, even we could call it, and find vastness of who you are, the expanded you that exists somewhat outside of our ordinary perspective.
Mm.
And when we do these practices, like breath work, for example, it gives us access to this greater portion of our being so that we can access that inner intelligence. We can um, put aside the ordinary mind, reach the higher mind and the deeper levels of intelligence that exist all around us. Some of it just a greater consciousness, a more expanded connectivity to everything, to all that is. And that just that mindset is very broadening. So for me, and I learned this especially when I had the fortune of meditating with others.
Mm.
You're trying to learn to meditate by yourself. You're never, well, I won't say never, but it can be challenging to figure out if you're really getting there. Doing it right is not the right phraseology because it can be anything, any kind of peacefulness, quietude can be considered a meditative state. But when you do it with other people who have a long experience of practice, suddenly you're in a space that's very much more open and creative and dynamic even. So whereas you might have thought that it could be sort of quiet and boring, not very much happening, what you find instead is when you put aside all of that very busy activity of the ordinary self, is this kind of vaster consciousness that's fluid and flowing and can be very, very high experiences, even to awe and wonder and grace, and all of these very expansive states that, and it's just really a lot easier if you find a group of people who are doing it and do it along with them. It
Mm.
really makes a difference if you can. Not to say that you can't do it alone, because certainly you can. And meditating alone is like the cornerstone of a spiritual practice, because if you're not sitting by yourself and learning about yourself, it's going to, your spiritual journey is going to take a lot longer. Yeah, you really
Mm.
do. You really must practice on your own and
Mm.
have some sense of momentum, get some kind of momentum going on that.
Mhm. How do you meditate? What's your favorite technology um, that you use to get you to that place of connection to the higher self? Because there is something about knowing when you have reached that connection. And it takes, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes practice. It's because the ego self is, that ego mind is very busy. And, there's about 60,000 to 90,000 thoughts going through our heads, our minds every day. So the mind is very busy and can be very distracting. And it has a way of holding negative beliefs that perpetuate themselves. Even the positive beliefs also perpetuate themselves. This is the only way we can have an experience because our beliefs are grounding us into what they say. So, how do we get away from these beliefs to a place where we're actually quite neutral, to a place where we're actually much more connected to unconditional love? And I always say, when we are in that place where we feel anything goes, we're in that place where we're not really aligning to the negative or the positive, but we're kind of neutral from a place of compassion, and we can see both sides. And it might be called sitting on the fence, but it's that place where you're actually quite happy and content with whatever comes. And you know that you can respond in a way that will serve your best outcomes. So it's because people will say, how do I know when I'm in that meditative state? And I would love to hear your perspective on that. How do you guide your clients? Because it's a word that is widely spoken. Meditation, meditation. What is your perspective on what meditation is in terms of that feeling? how would you guide someone to know when they have reached there? And then I'd love to know what your favorite technology is to in your meditation, because we've mentioned the silent walking by the beach, and what's your what's your go-to? Mine is a silent meditation. I'm always I just go into my silent space. I learned that from Eckhart Tolle on a course where he talked about object consciousness and space consciousness. And it was with Eckhart Tolle that I learned for the first time what space consciousness. That was amazing for me. Um, so my that silent space is really where I is my go-to. I'd love to hear yours.
Well, I have two practices that are my go-to, and the first one is the breath. And so there is a silence, but the breath gives the brain something to focus upon while moving toward the silence, getting through the resistance of the ego self and the chatter of the everyday world. So I do my breath practices, and it can be as little as 10 minutes. It doesn't take a long time to, although there are some much more elaborate practices that I know. And some, when I first learned, I did it for 30 minutes a day, every day. Um, but it's not necessary to do it quite that dynamically and still get some results. And so I do use the breath practice, and I arrive at that state of this neutrality that you're calling out. And I think that is a kind of equanimity or even-mindedness that that the wise ones talk about, because the mind is no longer attaching itself to this or that. Um, this is good, that's not good. Those sorts of judgments, that all falls away.
Mm,
And the other practice I do is this light body practice, as taught by Duane Packer on luminescence.com. He's passed away now, but he and his partner developed this beautiful internal practice of working with energies. So those are my go-tos, and that's not something that I can that I'm teaching at this moment. There are plenty of people who are teaching it, and you can um, find their journeys online. So for me, I guess what you so beautifully do in your silent space, finding that silent space, was really challenging for me. I needed something for my busy mind to do. And for me, breath was the thing that took care of that. And so um, you can begin by watching your breath. We all breathe every day. It happens beneath our notice. It's not something we have to pay attention to, but we can. And so when we do notice how our breath is, there's a lot of information there for us. If our breath is too fast, or it's too shallow, or it's very constricted, we are not going to have a very expansive experience. And so what I tell my students is that is the very first place that you begin, is to notice how your breath is in this moment, because you can read a lot about your state of mind, your state of being, by watching your breath. But then I also have other breath practices that I do that have an effect beyond simply breathing in and breathing out and watching your breath. They somehow reset the nervous system and create a peacefulness and a clarity within. Now, on the way to that peacefulness and clarity, sometimes you will get emotional sensations arising in your being. And you can use the breath practices to clear that emotionality out of your system so that you're not as reactive. It's one of the things I love about the breath practice. When I first came to the practice, I had a lot of emotions, many of which were not labeled correctly. A lot of things I thought were love were really not love. A lot of things that I thought were care were really not care. I
mm,
didn't understand anger at all. In the household I grew up in, um, I was not allowed to have anger. That was a very scary thing. There was a lot of anger around me. And so my response to that was to be very good, helpful child, mother's little helper, that sort of thing. And so when I got to adulthood and had all of this resentment and ill feeling inside of myself, much of that came from the fact that I had all of this repressed anger that I simply did not know how to do anything with. And
Mm.
through the practices of the breath, the anger rose up. And these are issues I knew I had. I had begun to talk therapy. I had talked about it. They were clearly
Mm.
identified for me, yet it was still in my body. It was
Mm.
still in my emotional body. And the breath practice helped me to clear that out. So I still had the understanding of what the issue was on a mental level. I still had the remembrance of the things that had happened to me as a younger person, but they no longer had the same emotional resonance as they did before. And that in and of itself was a revelation to me that these energies could still be with me and they could still be affecting me. So when I had an emotional interaction with somebody, it might not at all be about what was happening in our present moment, but about something that was from my deep past that
Mm.
had not been fully lived or cleared.
Mm.
And the breath practice was something that allowed me to do that. So over time, in this particular practice, and perhaps you've experienced this in your meditation practice, that when I would do the breath practices and have these emotional responses, and they were always accompanied by some kind of mental knowing, I was pretty easy to know what this was about. Where was this coming from? Because my inner wisdom was coming forward and it was giving me clues about what was really going on within me. And I
Mm.
just kept practicing the breath and I kept clearing the emotions and I kept reordering my belief patterns because a lot of the things I believed were not accurate. They certainly weren't working for me in my personal life. And over time, I became what I call emotionally current. I caught up to date with my emotional body so that when things happen now, for the most part, it's really about the thing that's happening in the present moment. I'm
Mm.
not being triggered by old emotional patterns that are invisible to me.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I have much more emotional peace and calmness and clarity. And I'm much more aware of what I believe about the world. Not to say that my belief system doesn't evolve, because it does. It's
Mm.
a work in progress. It's always a work in progress.
Yes, true.
And so through doing my breath practice, I would arrive at these states. I would clear out whatever was coming up for me in the moment. And what was left behind was this kind of shining, this sort of openness, a sense of deep relief, a sense of being cared for at a very deep level of my being, and being held by a benevolent care. And these were things that maybe I had felt as a young child, but I hadn't really felt in a very long time. And that was a revelation. That was that I could get to that space by doing these breath practices, by paying attention to what I felt and what I thought about as a result of my practice, and then to be left in this beautiful place where this it's like an out breath that you've been trying to breathe out for your whole life, and you just relax into it, and then you have that spaciousness. And for me, that was what the meditative state was about, was that clarity, that spaciousness, that fresh vista, that opening to seeing things with a new perspective, and then coming off the cushion and out into the world and being able to stabilize that in myself. That I came away from my meditation practice changed. I didn't immediately revert back to the difficulty or the challenged or the wondering, oh, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to be, I don't know who I am. That all fades over time because you
Mm.
do know who you are, and you listen to your inner wisdom, so you do know what to do and you do know how to be. And I've come to the understanding in recent times that being is the real great place to be, right? So we have
Mm.
plenty of things we have to do, but how we be in our life is really where the magic is. Would you agree with that?
I do totally. The difference between being an empowered being and living as a victimhood. As the empowered being, you know that you are consciousness and you have experienced it enough to feel really comfortable. And we all have different permission slips. I would love to know a bit more about this breathing practice. So, how would you differentiate between the breathing that we do on a day to day and the breathing practice? What is different about the two? Because the breathing practice definitely comes about, brings about a lot of healing of trauma, as you have said. And then the breathing is the taking in of breath. Breathing obviously is the first human need, the basic, the need of oxygen.
Yeah.
So we've got to breathe that oxygen in order to keep the cells. And it's more than, there's a lot to the life force because there's a life force within us. And there's something that that breathing connects to, the breathing, the in breath and the out breath. So breathing is much more than we think
Mhm.
sometimes. And I'd love to know more about that, how you differentiate between the day-to-day breathing and the breath practice that you do.
That, that's a wonderful question, and thank you for asking that. Um, well, obviously, breathing is essential nourishment. It has to, we have to breathe every day, and we have to expel the product of metabolism that is part of what our body does. You might be surprised to know that we excrete most of the waste that our body creates. The greatest portion of waste by our body is through our outbreath, getting rid of those processes, the byproducts of metabolism goes out on the breath. But you've touched upon something really essential. And I'm very, very pleased that you know this, because breath is more about an exchange of gases and byproducts of metabolism. Breath is vitality. And the breath practice that I studied, Pranavayu, means breath of life. So our breath teacher would tell us that prana or chi or life vitality would rides the waves of oxygen that come into our body. And so as we have this attuned awareness to how we breathe, we are becoming attuned to this life vitality. Now, some of the practices themselves create more space in your breathing capacity. So we have one breath where we place our hands on either side of our ribs, breathe in, and as we exhale, we press on the rib cage to assist in the exhalation of the breath. So the ribs themselves should pivot. Your whole rib cage should move and swing back in. It's an opening and a closing. But for many of us, we breathe very shallow up here in the top of our chest, or we might breathe in our belly, which is not a bad thing, but our ribs don't really move very much at all. And so the practice of expanding your capacity for breath expands your capacity for life. And a lot of the things that we were talking about earlier, emotional issues that are trapped in the body, are constricted. They're not being released properly because the breath is not moving very well in your body.
Mm.
So you're not metabolizing, you're not getting those byproducts out of your body, you're not getting the carbon dioxide out as well as you could, but you're also not allowing the flow of the breath to move into your body. So there's a lot of information in how we breathe. For example, if you sit and just take in a breath and pause for a moment and then breathe out and pause for a moment. So there are the four parts of the breath. There's an inhalation, there's a small pause, there's an exhalation, and there's a small pause. So for those of us who have trouble bringing the breath in, perhaps you have trouble letting life in. Maybe you are closed off a little bit from life. You're afraid, or you're anxious, or you're nervous, or you were taught to make yourself small, don't take up so much space. that constricts your capacity for living. So now you've breathed in and you're pausing at the top. And this one was a hard one for me. I wanted to give it all away right at the very moment I had it in me. But if you can pause for a moment and allow that nourishment to circulate in your body, then you can learn to keep your energies for yourself, that this is your nourishment, this is your life. You deserve to have nourishment, you deserve to have vitality and abundance. Now you breathe out. Well, is it hard for you to let go? Some of us, it's hard for us to let go, right? And you can feel that in your breath. You can recognize, oh, I don't breathe out very well. Many times people think that breath practice is about getting in a really big breath, but you can't fill a cup that's already full. The very first thing I teach is how to exhale, how to let it go, how to let everything release so that you fully cleanse and empty with each breath. Now, the lungs do retain a small amount of air all the time. They don't completely deflate. I'm not talking about trying to completely empty your lungs, because that's a catastrophic state and we don't want that. What I am talking about is a kind of fluidity, an
Mm,
openness, release, being comfortable with the letting go.
mm,
Then you get to the bottom of the breath where there is nothing except faith that there will be something more for you. So if you have trouble remaining at the bottom of the breath in that empty space, that says something about your faith that the world will provide for your needs, that
mm,
the universe is friendly, that you have capacity, that there's something there for you. And of
mm,
course, for all of us, the breath returns. It's
mm,
it's like it's like a holy covenant of
mm,
life that we
mm,
will have breath. It's there. It's not, we can't continue without continuing to breathe. But if
mm,
we can recognize, if we can just sit and listen to our breath, inhale and pause, exhale and pause, and then getting a nice even rhythm with the
mm,
breath. How does that feel? Just being able to make your breath a little more rhythmic balances your metabolism, it balances your brain, it balances your whole energy field. It brings your body, mind, and spirit, your emotional body, everything comes into harmony. All this from breathing.
it's powerful, really
It's
powerful.
very powerful.
Yes, and I read somewhere we can probably go 3 minutes, generally go 3 minutes without breathing, and then we at risk of losing our life. It's one of the first, the very first human need is air to breathe. So it's a very powerful life force that life attaining activity that we do, life enforcing, life bringing
Mhm.
activity that we do. And I love the way you really described how the breathing practice of pausing, those steps allow us to develop resilience, develop passion for self, because we are connecting to it's not just oxygen, it's primary. There is a consciousness, there's an intelligence behind the breath. And I love the way you said that intelligence, that consciousness is riding on the oxygen that is breathed in. And I also loved what you said about how what we breathe out is really containing the majority of our waste. And when we learn to really breathe out, because a lot of the times we're holding our breath. I know when I started to learn to breathe properly, and it's still a journey. They I found out that I didn't breathe much. I spend most of my time holding my breath. So it's interesting what we discover when we begin to think about how do I breathe? How
Mhm.
do I how do I let life in? And how do I let go of what I no longer need? This
Right.
is a very powerful process. And I love the way you put it. So how do you teach do you teach in 8 weeks or 6 weeks, or do you teach online? How do you work with your clients?
Well, I don't have clients particularly. I have a podcast where I teach the breath practice that I know on a weekly basis. And we do the breath practices. I've been at this particular podcast for about 3.5 years. So there are some more beginner phases of the practice earlier on. It's a cumulative practice, as you said, it's
Okay.
a work in progress. So early on in the earlier seasons, there's a little more explanation about the breaths and the different ones. There's also some information on my website that shows there's some written material instructions. When I learned to do this practice, I would go to the classes for a couple of hours once a week, but we also had a little booklet with the steps. And so then she would put all of the breaths together one right after the other, but then I would forget what the steps were. So I'd go back to my little booklet and read the steps and go, okay, I remember that one now, and I would do it. And so I have some information on my websites. It's very specific, breaks it down very carefully. Um, so it's a journey. We do our breath practice early in the hour that we are together on the podcast, and then I do some kind of guided meditation, um, and I'm just using my study over many years of study of consciousness and spirituality. I'm listening for my own inner guidance. My podcast also, I have a small group of students that are with me every time I make my recording. So I'm not doing this alone. I have a group of friends really who've been with me for a long time. Some of them are longtime students that have been breathing with me for 20 years or more. And so they are following along, and they are contributing their consciousness of the breath practice and the meditation, so that when you hear the recording, you're not just hearing my voice, but you're feeling the surround and the mental, emotional, and the meditative field that we are creating as a group. And it's surprising how effective that can be, that you can listen to this recording and get it. You are as though entering into a room on the inner planes that's always there, and you're being accompanied by experienced guides, experienced people who are also meditating with you. And I find that it really is very, very powerful, and it works very well.
What's the name of your podcast? And where can we find it?
My podcast is called Miriam's Meditations, and my name is Miriams Meditations. And it's on all the major podcast servers. I'm on Apple and Spotify and Google and all of the various servers. And it's free. There's no charge
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
it. Um, I do have a sense of offering it as an act of service. This is
Mhm.
something that I've known and I've practiced for a really long time. I've told many people about it over the many years, and I've got various responses to this practice, but it feels like it's having a bit of a moment now that people are
Oh yeah.
interested, and there is space in people's consciousness in this moment to learn these new inner technologies. And so I'm very, very pleased to be able to offer them, because it's my knowing that as we look out at the world and see all of the challenges and problems that are out there, and sometimes feel rather helpless about being able to do anything about it, that we can do something about it. And that is
Mhm.
to work on ourselves and to make our own world more peaceful and more beautiful and more harmonious. Because now, once we have made those efforts, the world has more peace, beauty, and harmony. It is a one-to-one relationship. We are actively helping to create the world. And so as we work on ourselves with these various inner technologies or spiritual work or consciousness, etc., then we are contributing to all of humanity through our own personal work. We become different how we move through the world, so that when we are interacting with people, even casually at the grocery store, or walking your dog in the neighborhood, or riding on the subway, whatever it is that you are doing, you are carrying this much more peaceful energy around with you, and people feel it. Just like an angry person comes in and yells at the cashier at the grocery store, and everyone's very uncomfortable. No one likes that. And the poor person who's doing the checking is it's not a nice thing for any of us to experience. And so the very opposite is really very, very powerful, that you're carrying this much more loving, much more open-hearted way of being in the world.
Mm,
And so you invite genuine connection from others,
mm.
because people want to be near that kind of energy.
Yes, yes, it's a wonderful reflection. The reflection that we create when we are in that space, where we have surrendered, where the ego mind is surrendered, is less distracted, is less traumatized. Um, when we are in that place, the reflections that we see of our own self
Mhm.
are more loving. Um, and the changes that we want start from within us. So I love that technology that you offer, and I love the podcast that you offer. And I did want you to just say the names, and thank you for doing that for those who are listening, who are not going to be watching this on video, so they would hear you spell it out. So thank you for that. So yes, I think we have covered that really nicely. Do you have any last words before we go today?
Close your eyes for a moment
Hmm.
and imagine an inner smile. Perhaps the smile is not on your face, but in your deeper being, or perhaps in your heart. And now imagine that your breath is drawing into that smile and flowing out of that smile, or flowing into your heart and out of your heart. And do a few rounds of this kind of breathing, where you are recognizing your own worth, your own loving inner being, and the joy that that inherently brings. And when you amplify that with your breath, you are contributing not only to the betterment of your own life, but you are expressing a gift for all of creation.
Beautiful. That's
Thank
beautiful.
you so much for this lovely conversation. This was so much fun to speak with you. I really enjoyed myself.
Me too. It was both ways, mutual, mutual, very mutual. Thank you for joining me today, Miriam. And thank you for that lovely meditation. Just lovely pause from all the ongoings that tend to happen. That was a really, really nice pause. Thank you. I'd like to thank my audience for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you join me on the next episode of the Daily Soul Bytes show. Bye bye.